Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Anu Hasangri from the Hepatitis B Foundation, where I'm the program manager for the Foundation's liver cancer program called Liver Cancer Connect. Today's webinar, Clinical Trials in Liver Cancer, is presented by Jill McNair and Katelyn Levy. Jill McNair is the Director of Education, Outreach, and Community Support at the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation, or CISRIP. CISRIP is an independent nonprofit organization dedicated to educating and informing the public and patients about clinical research, and it also provides information and resources for research and health professionals. Katelyn Levy is a clinical research coordinator in the Department of Gastroenterology and Hepatology at Johns Hopkins Suburban Hospital, where she works with the department's research teams and patients to coordinate the clinical trials. Today, the panelists will explain what clinical trials are and what you need to know about participating in a trial. You're welcome to send in questions using the chat box feature. This is located in the control panel on the side of your screen. We'll try to address as many of your questions as possible, and we'll also be posting the responses to all of the questions later on our website, livercancerconnect.org and hepb.org. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Jill.
Thanks, Anu. Hi, everybody. My name is Jill McNair, and I've been at CISGRP for about 7 years now. And CISGRP really is passionate about educating the public, patients, and their families about what clinical research is, how to get involved, what are the benefits and risks. And I've been here for a long time now, and it's really exciting to be invited by Hep B Foundation to participate in this webcast, just to give you some general information about what clinical research is and how you can make some decisions about it. So the first slide here is, let's see if I can flip here. There it goes. So I'm sure many of you, probably everyone on this phone, has taken some sort of allergy medicine, pain reliever, maybe some sort of prescription, maybe over the counter. Maybe you have a friend or family member who has hepatitis B, maybe has liver cancer, is a survivor. If any of these folks have taken any of these over-the-counter medicines or prescription drugs, you can thank a clinical research volunteer for their help in making that happen. Because really, all over the world, people are living longer, healthier lives because someone they never met before took part in a clinical research study. And that research is really what helps to find new cures, prevent cures, and of different medical conditions. And at CISGRP, we like to call these volunteers medical heroes because they really are the unsung hero. So what most people don't understand is that clinical research it's a whole process. Some people are afraid of it. Some people have seen Time magazine where they put a human being in a cage and they put, are we guinea pigs? And you might have heard all these different types of news stories, or you might have heard past abuses where there really weren't protections in place for clinical research volunteers. So at CISGRP, we really believe that education before participation is key. We believe that if more people really understand research, they'll appreciate it and they'll consider participating, and they might be more likely to participate. So I applaud all of you for joining today to hear a little more about what clinical research is all about. So what do we learn from clinical studies? We really learn, how does a new drug work? More importantly, sometimes we find out how it doesn't work, which is okay too. We can find out if there's a better way to treat a disease like cystic fibrosis. A lot of times we're testing drugs that might be something better than what is already on the market, and that's great too. We can look at how do genes affect illness. Does where people live change their health? And researchers can only answer these questions with the help of clinical research volunteers. So it starts with these questions, it leads to new questions, and that really gets us down the path of getting some answers. I didn't realize there were extra things here, I apologize, but there's what we can look at, people's environment and how it affects their health. So not every type of clinical trial is a drug trial. So there's studies going on where we're looking at, do people's environment affect their health? So you can look at where they live, what do they eat, how much do they exercise. So what is a clinical trial? It's a scientific study that answers a medical question. It answers, is a treatment safe? Does it improve a certain medical condition? Does it have side effects? How should people take it? And is it any better than medicines that are already on the market? So one important point here, and Kate will address this a little more during her presentation, but it's important to know that a clinical study is not the same as standard of care. So standard of care is what happens when you go to the doctor. It's routine care that's been tested and approved. It works for more people. You know when you break your arm, you're going to go to the doctor and you're going to get a cast. Whereas a clinical trial is something where we're looking for answers to a question. We're still learning how it works. So I think this is an important point, and I'm sure Kate will, again, like I said, she'll touch on it as we proceed in the second part of the presentation. So people are different, and you can't fully understand how something, you can't understand how something's going to work just by studying one group of people. We know things like being male or female, age, race, even your ethnicity are going to affect the way people respond to diseases and treatments. Let's say, for example, you have Alzheimer's disease. It actually happens twice as often in women than men. You've got type 2 diabetes and asthma, which are more common in African Americans. Hispanics, Asian, and white women are more likely to develop osteoporosis. And children, of course, they're going to respond to drugs differently than adults. So it's really important that scientists have all different types of people volunteering for research so they can see how different things react in different people. So clinical trials are a four-step process. Phase 1 is when a researcher is looking at, is it safe? And what should be the dose in patients? These are often healthy volunteers, and the goal of these trials is to learn, what is a safe dose? Does it work in the body? Is it harmful? Phase 2 really looks at more safety, and again, we're looking at dosing, and it's really on early data to see whether or not it works. Then moving on to phase 3, we're looking at, does it improve patients' health or make them feel better? So it may be new treatment, or it might be, like we talked about earlier, comparison to an existing therapy. And now we're starting to be testing in larger numbers of people and also getting into more diversity. Phase 4 is interesting. This is where we're looking at real-world experience. So these are studies that happen after a treatment has already been approved by the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. We'll talk about them in a little bit. They usually involve large numbers of patients who are taking this medicine on a regular basis. So again, it's been approved. Doctors are prescribing it. Lots of people are taking it. And so we're looking at the real world. What's going on out there? And there's actually systems for physicians to report back any adverse events that patients might encounter when they're taking this drug. And the FDA is constantly monitoring that to see if there's anything that's happening when it's gone to market that they need to be thinking about. So I do want to point out that clinical trials are sponsored by lots of different groups. Before I came into SysGrip, I would have thought that they were only sponsored by the government or a big pharmaceutical company. But now we have academic medical centers, you have medical device companies, you have biotech companies. So you have a lot of people who are out there sponsoring clinical trials. So let's take a look at the research team and the informed consent process. So research really does involve a lot of different people, and we like to look at it a little bit like a sports team. So clinical trials have coaches, players, officials, and each person really has an important role to play in the process. So our first person is a principal investigator. He's like the head coach of the team. They're responsible for organizing and leading the study. They record and study the data, and the PI is ultimately responsible for directing the whole research team. So they follow a protocol, or I like to call it the playbook, kind of like if we're thinking about football analogy. So they follow this protocol. It's a set of instructions that everyone in the game has to follow, and it's a plan for how the study will be carried out. And it's really important that this is followed. And when you're invited to participate in a study and you engage in a study, you should know that a PI is paying attention to everything. Now, your clinical research coordinator is more like an assistant coach. This is the person you're most likely to have daily interactions with, or your visits, your office visits. They're going to handle the day-to-day activities, they're going to work directly with the PI, and they're going to maintain contact with the volunteers. So volunteer protections are like referees. They actually look at a study before it even starts. They make sure that it's safe and that nobody's going to be at too much risk. They take a look at all of that. They make sure that the team follows the rules, and they keep you safe and informed throughout the process. So the Institutional Review Board, this is a group that gets together. It's made up of a variety of people, and people in the community can actually be involved and sit on an institutional review board, because this is the group that makes sure it's ethical and fair. They make sure that the trial is not too risky. They receive continuous updates on trial status. They look at serious side effects from study drugs. They decide if there needs to be a change in the study plan. And they can end a trial if it feels that the volunteers are not safe. So this is a group really looking out for the process. The next group is the Food and Drug Administration. Most of us have heard of them. They review studies. They actually go out and inspect research centers. They monitor research groups, and they have the final say as to whether or not a treatment is approved. So like most players, there's the volunteer. I'm sorry. So the volunteers are like the players. They really are the most important team member. There's a wide range of studies available that you can look into. There's clinicaltrials.gov. My organization, Subscript, has a website, searchclinicaltrials.org. And, you know, lots of people are needed, and even healthy volunteers are needed as well. There's also fans involved in the clinical research process. That's your friends, family, and your supporters. These are people you're going to talk to about the study. They're going to help you ask questions about the study. They're going to support you during the study. These people could be also the ones raising concerns to you, saying, you know, how about this? Did you really think about that? Are you sure this is the right thing for you? And those are good people to have on your side, because you want them to raise the questions that you can then go out and ask your doctor and get more information. So it's good to have all those folks on the team. So I love this slide because clinical research, you have a decision at every single step. You find out about the study and you can say yes or no. You can discuss it with your doctor. You can talk with research staff. You can go through the informed consent process. You can take part in the study. You can complete the study. But at any time, it's important for you to realize that you can say no and you can walk away from a study. Now, you want to talk to your research team before you would do that so that you take the appropriate steps and you're safe about it. But it is your decision at every step. And this is really education before participation is what SysGroup is all about. We talk about doing your homework, taking your time, asking questions, and really making sure that you have done your homework and done what you need to do. And I apologize, but I think I may have taken more of your time and actually spoken to some of Kate's slides because I was looking for the numbers on them and realizing they're not there. So I apologize, Kate, if we want to back up to some or where might be the best part to do that.
No, actually, I don't think that you have taken any of my slides yet. I think you're one more. And then,
oh, good. Well, I'm glad you're paying attention, so thank you so much. So this goes with the education before participation. Again, talk to your doctor. You want to get their input. You have advocacy groups like the Hep B Foundation where you can call them. They have resources. They have information that they can make available to you. You have even pharmaceutical and biotech companies have really great websites and resources, so you can check them out. And then there's a listing of the internet sites here. Again, I mentioned the SysGroup site. There's a great site I love on here called researchmatch.org, which is not associated with SysGroup, but it's something that I'm a member of and everybody in my family is. You go in and you put your own profile in, and you put where you live, what kind of diseases or conditions you might have, how far you're willing to travel for a study, and they reach out to you when there's a study available. They basically get an email, and it says this is available, and you can choose whether or not to explore it or not. And I really like that because it's passive. If you're looking to be more proactive, then you can look at clinicaltrials.gov. You can call the SysGrip office. We do searches by phone. If you're not into the internet, if you're not really online a lot, you can call SysGrip and they can help you with that as well. So I think there's a lot of great resources, and I'm going to now turn it over to Kate.
Thanks so much. So my name is Katelyn Levy, and I'm a research coordinator, and I work at the Johns Hopkins Community Hospitals in the DC area. And I've been a research coordinator doing hepatology and transplant research for about 5 years now. So I just want to give you a little bit more information about my perspective on clinical trials and how you would get involved. So in terms of the eligibility criteria for patients, that's really the criteria we're looking at to figure out whether or not you'd be a good participant for these trials. A lot of trials are looking at a very specific group of people. So maybe they're looking for, people who have hepatitis C and have, already been treated with a medication but were not cured. It's, they're looking at very specific groups for a specific trial or for a specific treatment to see if that medication is going to work in that group. So when you go on somewhere like clinicaltrials.gov, you really want to put in, maybe the condition that you have when you're looking through trials to make sure that you meet at least the basic eligibility criteria. The eligibility criteria often gets very specific, so it is something that you'd have to talk more about with, the research coordinator or the physician, the principal investigator. But on clinicaltrials.gov, I think you could get a general idea about whether or not you might qualify for a certain trial. There we go. So informed consent is what we call a process, and it's really a process because it's continuous. Like Jill said, if at any point during a clinical trial you wanted to stop, you could always talk to your research coordinator about that, the principal investigator, the physician about that, because you didn't want to do it anymore. So we say that consent is a continuous process. You're always giving consent to move on to the next step. But the informed consent process really starts before the trial. It's when you and your physician and the research coordinator all talk about the trial to see whether or not you'd be a good candidate for it and whether or not it's something you're interested in doing. You may look at the trial and say, this is too risky for me. It's not the right decision for me. And that's okay. Or you could look at the trial and say, this is a really great opportunity and I'd like to take part in it. And that's fine too. So you'll look at the informed consent form, which is often a very lengthy document that will tell you, why we're doing the study, what the risks of the study are, what the study schedule is, how often you're going to need to come back in for the study, what tests are involved, what treatment is involved, things like that. So that really is an important document to read carefully. I know it can be very lengthy, and sometimes there is, template language in there that can be a little bit confusing. So you should always ask your research coordinator about it or your principal investigator. But do read it carefully and do spend some time thinking about it. Maybe discuss it with a friend or a family member and see if this is the right thing for you. And then once you decide that this is something that you'd like to do, you sign the consent form, and you should get a copy of that, of your consent form as well, just for your records so that you can keep it, and you can also refer to it to see, are you on schedule, what's your next appointment, things like that. Your rights and responsibilities in the study. So as a participant in a study, you are really an active participant, and you should have your research coordinator's contact information and should be in communication with them. If you have questions, if you're not sure what to do next, you can always call them and see what the next step is for you. So should I or shouldn't I? I think that with research trials, it's really an individual choice. I think that there are trials that are right for some people and not right for others, and it's really about whether or not you're willing to do what's involved in the trial. So some trials do involve a lot of, follow-up or maybe extra tests, and so you have to say to yourself, am I okay with that? Am I willing to commit to come back in for those additional follow-ups? So understanding the study design, there are a number of kind of keywords that you'll see in your informed consent form, and they'll really often be in the title of the study. And so one of the ones you'll often see is randomized. So a randomized trial is a treatment trial, so you'd be getting some sort of treatment. And randomized means that you're either going to get one treatment or another treatment. And it's going to be like a coin flip. You're not going to be able to pick which one you want, and your study team will not be able to pick which one you get. You'll be randomly assigned to one group or another. Now, if you're in a blinded trial, that'll mean that whichever of the two treatments you're assigned to, you won't know which one you're assigned to. So you can have that would be a blinded trial, would be if you didn't know which one you were assigned to. And an open label trial would be one where you did know which one you were assigned to, but it could still be randomized. You could still be automatically put in one group or another, but then they would tell you which group you were in. Now, there are also placebo trials. So placebo trials are where you get randomly assigned to one group or another, but one group would be a treatment, and one group would be no treatment. So it could just be a sugar pill. So if you saw a randomized, blinded, placebo-controlled trial, that would be a trial where it was like the flip of a coin, and you got put in one group or the other, and you didn't know which group you were put in, and you could either get treatment or you could get a placebo. So there are kind of different combinations of those words that you'll see, and it's important to understand what kind of trial you're going into. So there are a number of benefits that you can get from clinical trials. I think a big one is an access to a new or promising therapy. Of course, part of why we're doing the clinical trial is to find out if this treatment is effective or what additional side effects are. But it could be a very promising therapy. I think about new therapies, especially in, let's say, the hepatitis C realm or something like that, where you have this new and upcoming therapy that you would like to have access to. I think that the most important reason people do clinical trials is to help other people. And it really is a great way to help other people who have a similar condition to you and are able to provide these new therapies to the next generation, especially when you think about all of the therapies that are currently available. And like Jill said, those have all been tested by a research participant with a condition similar to yours before you. And I think that an often unspoken benefit of clinical trials is just how closely the research staff works with you and observes your health. Often with clinical trials, there are additional tests, additional safety measures in place, and so you really will get additional attention from the principal investigator or research coordinator. You'll have a lot of extra eyes on your healthcare. So it's also important to think about the potential risks of a study. I think that the one we think about most often is the physical risk. Is this going to make me sicker? Am I going to have some sort of adverse event? An adverse event is what we call a bad reaction to part of the clinical trial. So are you going to have some sort of adverse event? I think that one we often don't think about is the emotional impact of clinical trials. Clinical trials can be stressful for people who are involved in them, just because it can involve some extra follow-up, extra time, and that's something to think about before you enroll. For emotional risk, the one I think about most often is if there's genetic testing involved. I think that aspect can be very stressful for people, so that's something you want to think about beforehand. Do I want genetic testing? If that's part of the study, it's not for all studies, but from time to time it can be in there as well. There are also financial risks. And that's something to talk to your study team about before you start the study. What part of this is going to be covered by my insurance? What part am I going to pay for? What part is the research study going to pay for? That's certainly something that should be discussed before the research starts. Generally, as a rule, what happens with these types of studies is that anything that's standard of care, so remember we talked about standard of care being things that are what would routinely happen if you didn't participate in this trial. So if your doctor is having you get blood work every 3 months anyway, those every 3 months blood work would probably still be covered by your insurance because you would have gotten that whether or not you participated in the clinical trial. And then generally what's covered by research are things that you're doing only for the research trial. So sometimes this includes the medication that you might be receiving as a part of the research trial. Sometimes this includes extra safety tests. So maybe for the research trial, they need to do additional tests of your heart or additional blood work, just specifically to safeguard you in terms of the medication. Then that is generally covered by research. And then privacy and confidentiality. This is something to always think about in terms of research as well, because you are having additional eyes on your medical records, additional people having access to them. And that's important for the research because you need to allow the researchers to collect all of the information about you so that can be studied later. But it is just additional people having access to your medical records. So a couple of things to consider before you enroll in a clinical trial is how much time it's going to take for you. Are there additional follow-ups? Are you going to be able to come to those? I know we say that you can always leave a clinical trial, and of course you can always withdraw if you decide that it isn't the right thing for you anymore. But it's important to know up front whether or not you might be able to meet the study schedule. The clinical trial could also end at any time if the sponsor, so the sponsor might be the pharmaceutical company, whoever owns the drug, if the sponsor decides that they don't want to run this trial anymore, or they had an adverse event happen with another participant and they feel it's no longer safe to continue the trial, then it could be stopped at any time. You also might not feel better from this trial. That's really part of what the clinical trials mechanism is about. It's about finding out whether or not this drug helps people feel better, helps their condition, and the truth is it might not, and we certainly hope that it does, but that's part of the clinical trials process. And of course, all of your doctors need to know that you're on a clinical trial. It is important if, let's say, you're getting a new medication for your hepatitis B, but you also go see a cardiologist, that your cardiologists know that you're participating in this trial and that you're receiving an additional drug. The same way you'd want all of your doctors to know about all of the medications that you are taking, you'd want them to know about your clinical trial participation as well. That is also something that you can speak to your research coordinator about, or your principal investigator about, whether or not they're going to inform your other doctors, or whether or not they'd like you to inform your other doctors. Oftentimes, principal investigators or research coordinators will reach out to your primary care physician to let them know that you're participating in a clinical trial. So here are some things to think about asking while you're going through the informed consent process, or before you sign the informed consent document. These would also be good things to write down and to bring with you to an appointment when you are going to talk about a clinical trial, just so that you didn't forget to ask them, because they are important. So you want to know what procedures are involved in the study, and what of those procedures are standard of care. What are you going to get anyway, even if you don't participate in this clinical trial? And what's different? What additional things are you getting or not getting because you're participating in this clinical trial? What are the risks? What are the risks that we already know about? And what are some of the anticipated risks? And then what are the costs? How are we going? Who's paying for the standard of care things? Who's paying for the items that are only for research? So what happens in a clinical trial? It's quite a long process, and it starts long before we even enroll a participant. So it starts with a study design, and that study design is usually done by the sponsor, whoever that may be, whether it's a pharmaceutical company, a device company, an academic center, whoever thinks of the trial in the first place. And they'll submit that trial design to the FDA. And the FDA looks it over and says, is this a worthwhile trial to do? Is this scientifically sound? Once the FDA approves it, the sponsor, whoever is doing the trial, will ask academic centers all over the country to participate in that trial. And those academic centers will look at the study design, and they'll show it to their institutional review board. That's their IRB. And if you recall, the IRB is the group that looks at a study and says, how are the risks? What are the benefits? What kind of burden does this put on study participants? Is this appropriate for our institution? And if the IRB says that it's okay, then that academic center will start enrolling. So that's where participants come in. They can start to enroll in the trial wherever it has been opened and approved. From the time they're enrolled, they might be randomized, and you'll recall that randomization is when you're randomly put into one of a number of either treatment groups or treatment and placebo groups. Then you'll receive the treatment for however long the study design says, and then you'll also go through a follow-up phase. For treatment trials, there's always a follow-up phase where after you stop taking the medication, the study team is going to want to follow you for a while and say, in the long term, did you have any benefits? Did you have any adverse events, any adverse effects? Oh, my slide's not advancing. There we go. So after the follow-up phase, as a clinical trial participant, your role will end, but the trial still goes on for the principal investigator, the research coordinator. After your participation in the trial ends, as a research coordinator, I collect all of the data. So that would be the results of your lab tests, the results of imaging, maybe any adverse events that you had, were you hospitalized. That's all the data that we collect. And I put it into a system so that it could be analyzed. And then the analysis will look at safety and efficacy to really answer the original questions that we set out to answer. Is this drug safe? Is it effective? Is it better than something we have on the market? Then these results are submitted to the FDA, and the FDA looks at them as well and answers a lot of those same questions for itself. And they say, is it okay for this drug to be approved for public use? Is it not okay to be approved for public use? Can we start to put it on the market? So at this point, when the FDA, after they review the results can be made public. And depending on the phase of the trial that you're in, we might move to the next phase, or the drug might be approved by the FDA for the general public. So if you'll recall, Jill talked about the 4 phases of clinical trials. So if you were looking at, a phase 2 trial where we're really just looking for safety and preliminary results for efficacy, and the FDA looked at those results and said, yes, we think this is a worthwhile drug to continue to study, then the sponsor would go ahead and design and implement a phase 3 trial to really look more at the efficacy and take a deeper look at the safety. I think that is all for me. But please submit your questions and let me know if there is anything I can answer for you or anything that is unclear. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Jill and Katelyn, for a very informative webinar, and to all the participants who sent in questions. We have a few that we'll start off with. Katelyn, there's a question here about when to think about participation. Should they start as soon as they have been diagnosed with liver cancer or after having received treatment with standard care?
I think that it's an excellent idea to start thinking about participating in a clinical trial as soon as you've been as soon as you've been diagnosed with liver cancer, if that's something that you're interested in. There are trials available for people who have not been treated for their liver cancer, as well as people who have been treated. Maybe they've been treated unsuccessfully, or the first treatment wasn't as effective as they needed it to be. So I think that it's a good idea to look at participation in a clinical trial before treatment, because if you find a trial and you think, maybe later down the road, I'd like to participate in that trial, but I want to try the standard care first. And see if that works for me, and then later move on to a clinical trial. Or you could say, I'd like my first line of defense to be participating in a clinical trial, and that's okay too. But at those beginning stages, I think you can really look and see what all of your options are, both in the short and long term.
Okay. So that kind of leads into another question we received. If I've already started a treatment with another drug, can I still participate in a clinical trial?
Yeah, so you'd have to find a clinical trial where it was okay that you'd already been treated with another drug. I guess that also leads into the question, is the drug you're currently being treated with experimental, or is it part of standard of care? It's fairly unusual to be able to participate in one clinical trial for a specific condition and then later participate in another clinical trial for that same condition. I think that from a scientific perspective, that can be tricky to differentiate between the effects of the two new treatments. So for a lot of people, though, if they've been treated with one, what we call standard of care treatment, and then that doesn't work for them or isn't as effective as they'd like it to be, then they can move on to participate in a clinical trial, and that's pretty common.
Okay. We have a question here about the eligibility. You mentioned that in the presentation. Understanding inclusion and exclusion criteria, or whether you're eligible, how do patients and their family members get to learn about this, whether they're eligible or not, or whether the patient is eligible?
Sure. So I know we talked about inclusion criteria, and I guess we didn't talk much about exclusion criteria. But both of those, or some of the highlights of the inclusion and exclusion criteria, are often listed somewhere like clinicaltrials.gov. They'll always be in the consent form. If you actually see a consent form from a physician, they'll be in there as well. And you can always talk to your physician about it, or you can look at it and see just the general highlights of what the eligibility is. So a lot of the eligibility criteria are often things like, participants must be age 18 or older, so it's pretty self-explanatory, must have, hepatocellular carcinoma, and then maybe you'd have just as an example, of course trials are different, but just as an example, maybe you'd have an exclusion criteria of metastatic disease. And so you can look at those inclusion, exclusion, and get a general sense of whether or not you might be eligible. Some of the inclusion and exclusion often get much more specific than that. Maybe they're looking at certain, indicators in an electrocardiogram or, a test that looks at your heart. And those might be better served, being looked at by your physician or by a nurse to tell you whether or not you qualify on some of those more specific criteria. But I think from an overview perspective, you can always look on clinicaltrials.gov or in the consent form.
Okay. We have a question here about taking supplements. What about taking supplements and herbal remedies while participating in a trial?
It's very important that as a participant in a trial, you let your research coordinator and your physician know about all of the medication, including herbal remedies that you're taking. That's something that they would definitely want to know about.
Okay.
And it's not necessarily exclusionary. That's something you talk to them about, whether or not it's okay to continue taking those. But it's something that it does need to be discussed.
Okay. And then there's a question here from someone about off-label. So how often are patients prescribed the drug in trials off-label?
So there are specific categories of clinical trials that are off-label. So that's something that we talked about in the consent process. And you want to know, is this drug approved for another indication? So what happens is sometimes drug companies have, or whoever owns the drug has FDA approval to use this drug in a specific, we call a specific patient population. And maybe they think that it would also be effective in a different patient population, or a group with a slightly different or very different disease. And so you'd want to know what were the side effects in the group that it's already been approved for, and how do we anticipate those being different maybe than for your specific patient population group, so the people with a disease similar to you.
Okay. We get quite a few questions about placebo. So will I still get treatment if I have if I'm randomized to a placebo treatment, placebo arm?
So it depends on the trial, but for all trials, you'll be told beforehand if you're in a placebo-controlled trial, one where you might get randomly assigned to a placebo arm. And for most trials, I would say, where there is a placebo arm, generally what happens is that everybody in the trial gets standard of care treatment. So what you would normally get if you had not participated in the trial, everybody gets that. And then in addition to that, you might get the treatment or a placebo.
I see. Okay. And then what about if my doctor is not conducting any clinical trials? Would I still get to learn about clinical trials, and how and what would I do to find out more about trials in other centers?
So if your doctor is not currently participating in any clinical trials, I would look on clinicaltrials.gov and see what trials were being conducted at different centers in your area. And you'd have to think about whether or not you would like to go see a different doctor so that you could participate in a clinical trial. And that's not to say you couldn't continue to see your regular doctor, but you'd have to additionally see the doctor who was conducting the clinical trial.
Okay. And we have quite a few questions about costs. Who pays? And I think you covered that. But could you just summarize that again in terms of what it means to participate in a clinical trial from the financial aspect?
Sure. So it's different with different trials, but I would say generally, whatever is normally standard of care is covered. It will be continued to cover however you would have paid for your standard of care. So whether you have insurance and that standard of care is covered by your insurance or you pay for it out of pocket, those things will continue to be covered that way. And anything that you're doing in addition because you're participating in a clinical trial, so this might include the cost of the drug, the cost of additional testing, those will generally be covered by the study itself.
Okay.
And then it's something we haven't talked about yet is payment to participate in trials. From time to time, there are trials where participants are paid to be a part of them, and that can often be because the trial can involve a lot of time or a lot of kind of extra effort on the participant's part. So the trial might reimburse the participant for parking or things like that, or might just pay a flat fee. And the thing to remember about those is that you will need to submit some additional paperwork so that the institution can pay the participant. So this might be a W-9, and then you have to follow appropriate tax regulations. You can get taxed on those things as well.
So if a study participant has questions, do they contact the the clinical research coordinator? Who is their main source of information or main contact?
So the main contact for participants in clinical trials is the clinical research coordinator. They deal with most of the day-to-day activities, the scheduling, maybe payments of participants, making sure that you have all your appointments, you have all your questions answered, things like that. If you feel like, if a participant feels like they're having a medical issue, it's important to also talk to the principal investigator or the physician who's involved in the trial about those things. But I think that the research coordinator is a good first point of contact to find out where you should go next.
Okay, and I just want to recap then on a couple of the resources that both you and Jill mentioned. There's clinicaltrials.gov, which is a website where you can find clinical trials, and you can search by either the drug name if you already know it, or the condition, or even by site, by location. There's also cancer.gov, which is the website of the National Cancer Institute. And if you go on cancer.gov, you can see that they have a cancer information service where they have free help in English and Spanish from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time in the United States. Jill, maybe you can give us some information about the services that CISRIP provides.
Sure. So searchclinicaltrials.org is the one website that I mentioned before. And again, you can go there to search for a clinical trial, or you can call the 800 number to get more information. We also have an education center on our website, which is sysgrip.org. And we have questions to ask. We have some things that you can print off, like you could print off the questions to ask. You could actually take them with you to your doctor. We have informational videos that you can watch, which are interesting. There's a really interesting one called Speak Out, Speak Smart, and that talks about when you're in a clinical trial, what type of information is it okay for you to convey to other people that won't impact the study, especially in regards to social media and how you're posting. So there's some issues around that. So there's a nice video about that. There's some patient videos in there as well. There's the finding a trial, there's finding trial results, there's charts and statistics. So if you're interested in the top reasons why people participate in a clinical trial, you could go there and check out just some interesting tidbits. So I think it's a great website. We try to make it robust and try to make it sort of a one-stop shop where you can get information, general information about clinical research. So then you can go to a more disease-specific group like the Hep B Foundation if you want something specific to your disease, or you can go out to the clinicaltrials.gov if you're looking for something very specific as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think that pretty much covers everything. I do want to mention that livercancerconnect.org, which is a program of the Hepatitis B Foundation, provides a directory of liver cancer centers and a drug watch, and we also have a directory on clinical trials, which we are going to be expanding further, make it more specific for liver cancer. So this would be another resource that you could go to find out more about clinical trials specific to liver cancer. I don't see any further questions. Do you either of you see any questions on your screens? So I think we've come to the end of this presentation. I want to thank everyone for participating, and we hope you will join us in our next webinar, which is Support Services for Families Facing Liver Cancer. That's going to be on Wednesday, June 3rd at 1:30 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. And you can find the time, date, and registration for that webinar on livercancerconnect.org and hepb.org. Well, thank you again for joining us today. This concludes our webinar.